do that rumbling.
Dawn of War was a huge success back in 2004, so naturally Relic began work on an expansion, Winter Assault, that released just a year later in 2005. The expansion pack not only brought new content, but also addressed some of the problems people had with the base game. Just like that game's review, I'll be playing the campaign for the Definitive Edition, which still retains the gameplay of the original release. Winter Assault brings the Imperial Guard as a new race to play, which they technically were in the base game, but were campaign exclusive with only 3 units. Winter Assault fleshes them out into a full faction with their own unique gameplay, along with 2 new campaigns, new units for existing factions, and a new snowy biome to fight on, making a change from the more duller locales of the base game. I'm not going to go too in depth with the gameplay since it will be redundant. If you haven't checked out the base game review, watch that first. Here, I'll be covering the new stuff the expansion offers, the Imperial Guard and the campaigns.
We are the Imperial Guard. It is time we started acting like it. Run for your lives!
The Imperial Guard are much more of a grounded faction, not leaning too much into fantasy and magic, but instead relying on good old armaments, firepower and numbers, along with being more defensive. These lads aren't superhumans or have any power armor to support them, as evident by the commander being a squad of special units rather than a singular powerful hero. They're just regular humans sent off to die for the Emperor, and as such, tend to need some support, and in some cases, encouragement. Morale is a mechanic from the base game that has much more of a presence here since it's a weak point for the Guard. If you've seen what they're up against, can you blame them? They tend to break easily like in the base game, but now you have ways to keep up the morale, done through upgrades and attaching special units to your Guardsmen. One of these special units being the Commissar, who has his own unique brand of encouragement. Yeah, just straight executing his own men, very World War I-esque. Hey, it works, and even provides a huge buff to your units, so it's worth doing, in a morbid way. You also have the ability to garrison your structures and even fast travel between them, giving your infantry some flexibility to offset their weakness, although this makes the already underused transport vehicles more redundant. I do wish they had more options for defences, but I also get the devs don't want you turtling up too much. The other vehicle the Guards offers are more exciting, giving the army the much needed firepower that they need. You have Hellhounds, the returning Leman Rust tanks, Basilisks as the ancestral artillery, and the big boy, the Baneblade, a massive fortress on tracks with 11 barrels gunning down your enemies. Now combine this with my favourite unit in the game, the Kasrkin squads, the absolute best of the infantry, and you turn the Imperial Guard from a horde that needs constant reminders to hold the fucking line, to a terrifying army of fury that annihilates everything in its path. The Imperial Guard are my favourite faction. I always lean towards the good factions anyway, but the grounded nature and the more defensive playstyle really appeals to me. They almost feel like a ranged Orc faction with some elements of Eldar mixed in, very different to the other races and a great addition all around. The expansion also brings some balance changes, including introducing unit caps for relic units and builders, along with new units for the existing races. The Space Marines get the Chaplain, who's a melee focused hero unit, in addition to the already existing Force Commander hero unit. A bit redundant honestly. Eldar get the Fire Dragons, an anti-armor and anti-building option for the Eldar infantry. I don't know why, but I really enjoy using these units, and I'm not even an Eldar player. The Chaos get the Khorne Berserkers, a mid-game heavy melee infantry that you can get before the late game Possessed Marines, pretty good as a front line or for rushing, and much like the Possessed Marines, they can't break, so really good for tying up your enemy. And finally, the Orcs now have the Mega Armoured Knobs, which are effectively another hero unit, but instead come in a small squad rather than a single unit. A great elite unit they can chuck into your Orc horde. Winter Assault brings us 2 new campaigns, Order, which has you play as the Imperial Guard and the Eldar, and Disorder for the Orcs and Chaos Space Marines. Yeah, no regular Space Marines taking centre stage for once, although they do show up as their Ultrasmith variety. I like this approach, 2 smaller campaigns with 4 factions, totaling 10, 12, 14 missions? I can't give a hard number on the campaign missions, I'll clarify that later, but each campaign lasts around 4 hours, so 8 hours in total. I also played this on insane difficulty, which I explained in my previous video is actually just regular hard. Still not sure why they labelled it like this. Something to note though, Winterassault is a fair bit harder than the base game independent of the difficulty option, so keep that in mind, especially the Disorder campaign. Winterassault takes place on the icy planet known as Lorne 5, which houses a war machine known as a Titan, lost somewhere in a snowy hellscape, and all 4 factions want their hands on the Titan for one reason or another. But there's something else out there, something else that is due to arrive that'll turn everything on its head. The campaigns themselves are a big step up from the base game, with their mission structure being a massive improvement and addressing the shortcomings from before. The missions are far more varied, with new challenges and tasks being introduced mid-mission to keep things interesting, rather than just being destroy the enemy base in some way. Not only that, but they also introduce faction switching during a mission, so for example, you play in the Imperial Guard up to a certain point, then switch over to the Eldar Force segment, or switching from Orcs and Chaos for the other campaign. It's a great way out of the already varied objectives to keep things fresh, with you adapting to a new playstyle mid-mission. Some people may find it jarring switching between completely different factions, but I didn't have that issue. It was well executed, you're not flip-flopping between factions constantly. At most you only make 2 switches in a mission. My only gripe is the distribution of gameplay amongst the factions. The Disorder campaign is well balanced between the Orcs and Chaos, but the Order campaign feels like an Imperial Guard campaign with some Eldar segments, especially towards the end of the game with the Eldar's last mission. They really got the short end of the stick here. Okay, before getting into the story, I want to address a bug that comes with the Definitive Edition, which is the glitchy audio. I mentioned in the base game review how I experienced a problem with the music cutting out, but as it turns out it's only part of the problem, since this issue seems to be much worse in Winterassault, and as such has much more of a negative impact on the game. The bug manifests in 2 ways. One is the music cutting out or not playing at all. It takes a lot of the oomph out of the game and makes everything off-puttingly quiet. It's also especially a shame since the soundtrack is amazing in Winterassault, actually my favourite amongst the base game and the expansions. It sucks it just doesn't play at times. Second is sound effects and voice lines involving units not playing. This especially affects the audio feedback. Unit callouts stop playing, which makes you second guess whether or not they're actually following an order you've just given or even selected them. Also affects units giving you important information, such as an idle unit off screen being attacked, or your unit's morale breaking, which is particularly a problem with the Imperial Guard since, you know, it's a major mechanic for them. Now this bug as I described it is after a recent patch that addressed the audio issues, since before, there was a major problem with dialogue skipping that has been plaguing DE for months, particularly with Winterassault. It wasn't just related to pieces of the story being skipped, but also important information regarding changes to your objective. One particular instance I want to note was a mission where you're holding out for reinforcements. Admittedly I did fuck up here since I didn't build any anti-armor, but I was fighting and scrambling to survive before I realised the reinforcements I was waiting on were already here. The dialogue that informed me of their arrival got skipped, so I was flailing around like a dickhead waiting for help that had already turned up. Thankfully, this issue with the dialogue skipping has been fixed, not just for Winterassault but the whole of DE, along with some other minor bugs here and there. However, the issues with the music and sound effects are still present, and unfortunately, they aren't really being acknowledged, and to be clear, these issues were not present in the original version. Alright, where was I up to? Oh right, the story. So as mentioned, the story centres around a Titan on Lorne 5 that all 4 factions are gunning for. It's told in a similar way to the base game, although the actual story is more straightforward. Since the campaigns are shorter and are split between 2 races each, the narrative and plot ends up being much simpler. You don't get a web of characters with their own relationships and motivations. You only really get the main commander and another generic hero unit for them to bounce off, so it lacks a more in-depth story or character developments like in the base game. The only highlight with the characters is the interactions between the 2 commanders of the respective campaign, particularly with the Chaos and Orcs butting heads constantly. The campaigns also go down a fairly simplistic route. Rather than having the 2 campaigns being concurrent, with their story and plot intertwined, they are instead different tellings of the story, effectively alternate versions. An interwoven story with the 2 campaigns would have been great to see, with you experiencing some missions from the perspective of a faction that you then fight against in the alternate campaign. Winter Assault only had a year in development, so writing and working on something like this was probably out of their scope. Still feels like a missed opportunity though. So overall, Winter Assault trades the base game focus on intrigue, mystery and character developments, but instead offers variety, different perspectives and some great character interactions between the factions, along with branching paths. So we're gonna start talking spoilers. If you want to skip, go to here. Let's start with the Order campaign first, with the Imperial Guard being led by General Sturnn to recover the Lost Titan, and the Eldar led by Farseer Teldir, who's preparing for the arrival of an unknown foe. While the two factions are not allies, the Eldar assist the Imperial Guard early on from the shadows as part of the larger plan, something General Sturnn isn't fond of, being helped by an unknown third party. Sturnn meets up with the Ultramarines who are transporting the Titan crew inside of a Land Raider, essential personnel to get the Titan up and running again. While the Eldar have been acting in the shadows up until now, a misjudgment of an Orc horde leads them on the run, and eventually find themselves stuck between the Orcs and the Imperial Guard. Farseer Teldir contacts General Sturnn, coming clean about her interference in the Guard's operations, warning him of an incoming threat that the Eldar are preparing for, and requests his assistance. Sturnn, surprisingly, agrees to help the Eldar from the Orcs, as he admits he noticed some strange readings since arriving on the planet. After dealing with the Orcs, Teldir informs Sturnn of the incoming threat, the Necrons, an ancient race that have been around for eons, and will be arriving on Lawn 5 at the location of the Titan, for some reason. Sturnn doesn't put much faith in their words as he clearly distrusts the Eldar.
You Eldar are always trying to manipulate us into fighting your battles. Hecate 7, Tartarus, here!
I mean, the Eldar weren't exactly wrong on Tartarus. Regardless, they come to an uneasy alliance as the enemies align, and Sturnn would rather know the Eldar's whereabouts rather than have them skulking in the shadows. As we get to the fourth mission, the story, narrative and mission structure take an interesting direction, since now you can switch between the Imperial Guard and the Eldar on the fly, and both have their own objectives. However, only one can complete their mission and proceed through the gate to the Titan, so the alliance between the two factions crumbles. This was why I mentioned earlier that it's hard to give a hard number on the amount of missions there are, since here is basically two missions in one, and there are two different final levels depending on which faction complete their objectives. I really like this approach, although here in the Order campaign, the mechanic feels a little underutilized since you basically just pick one faction and go, but it's still a bit of a shame that the series doesn't do something like this again. So now we enter the finale. The Imperial Guard version involved them trying to get the Titan back online, and actually defending multiple points and generators from the Orcs and Chaos. However, things get dire when the looming threat throughout the game finally makes their presence known, the Necrons. The Necrons are effectively the final boss of the game, carving through the Orcs and Chaos, creeping towards your front lines. This is where Sturnn decides to use the weapons on the Titan against the Necrons in a last-ditch effort to survive. This finale is incredible, scrambling your defences, obliterating the Necron monoliths with the Titan's weapons, while pushing back the carnage of the Necron, Orcs and Chaos freefall at your front lines, with this fantastic music playing and an orchestra of mayhem blaring out, at least for the original version. Yeah, the soundbook I mentioned before raised its ugly head, taking some of the impacts out of the finale. It is better than it was pre-patch though. But overall, the Imperials have an incredible final mission. The Eldar's version by comparison is honestly a little limp. It's too fucking easy, even on insane. Your webway assembly can one-shot the monoliths with a long cooldown, but you can take command of the Titan's weapons with nothing more than your builders. Along with the monoliths only really come in one at a time, so you're not spreading your forces out at multiple points too much. And if all of that wasn't enough of a crutch already, General Sturnn joins the fight and is actually your ally. You even gain loose command of some of his units that can be used to hold a choke point. Why they gave the Eldar such an easy time, I don't understand. The mission ends with the Eldar defeating the Necrons but needing to quickly escape, as the Titan ended up unstable and is going to explode, killing everyone. Yeah, I'm starting to understand why the Imperials and Eldar have such a rocky relationship. So that concludes the Order campaign. Let's move on to the Disorder one. The Disorder campaign starts with Gorguts, yes, the same war boss from the base game, rallying together a new war clan to fight the forces of Chaos with. As he rises to the top of the clans, the smaller clans fall in under Gorguts' banner, and so he now leads the Orcs and Lorn 5 for our almighty WAG. The forces of Chaos led by Lord Krull, however, revels in this, as all his bloodshed and carnage would serve his dark god well, along with satisfying his own endless bloodlust. But the Imperial Guard come and crash the party, causing the Orcs and Chaos to focus their attention on the party crashes, in which they capture a guardsman who spills the beans on the Titan. Krull wants the Titan for himself and use it as a weapon, while Gorguts wants to scrap it for parts, so the two form a "we'll kill each other later" agreement, ironically one that's more trustworthy than the Eldar and Imperials. Moving to the fourth mission, you need to prevent both the Order factions from completing their objectives, and then proceed through the gate with one of your own. The faction switching is somewhat odd here, since it feels more utilised compared to the Order campaign, because you do need to use both factions, but you have to awkwardly ensure your armies don't confront each other since they're marked as enemies. It also highlights an issue where all your units will drop their orders when you switch factions, meaning you can't queue up a bunch of stuff and leave it going while you tend to the other faction. A really weird decision, and it does seem intentional. Anyway, whoever gets through the gate after completing the objectives goes to the finale, with neither of them aware of the Necrons' approaching arrival. The Chaos Space Marines' final mission involves making blood sacrifices in order to corrupt and gain control of the Titan, using guardsmen much like a prior mission, although way more annoying since you can't control squads with a sergeant. As you slowly gain control of the machine, the Necrons arrive, and unfortunately, they don't spill any blood for the Blood God. Also, they're gonna ruin Krull's plan for commandeering the Titan. The rest of the mission plays out similarly to the Order versions, with you using the sorcerers to control the Titan's weaponry against the Necron monoliths and beating back the onslaught, and eventually emerging victorious. The Orcs version plays a little differently. Gorguts' goal is not to control the Titan, but to scrap it, along with him wanting to claim the skull of Krull, who survived the last mission. So in order to claim his prize, Gorguts just starts destroying parts of the Titan as bait to lure out Krull, but as the two armies clash to finally hash things out, the Necrons come dropping in. So now the Orcs decide to deal with the Necrons first, then settle things with Krull. But how? Gorguts just spent the whole mission destroying the Titan's weapons, so how will the Orcs fight the Necrons and the monoliths? Hilariously, the Orcs just brute force it. No fancy Titan weapons or Xeno Soulstones. The Orcs take down the monoliths the good old fashioned way. After the Necrons are dealt with, now it's time for Gorguts to finally get his last skull, in which he kills Krull and conquers the planet, now eyeing which planet to take next. Overall, both these final missions are way tougher than the Order versions, but still a great set of finales. So that wraps up the campaigns. Overall, absolutely incredible. A big step up from the base game that was already great. The mission structures and how they handled the multiple factions and campaigns is some of the best in the series. Even despite some of my critiques about how they could have done some things differently, I still absolutely loved what they did do. It was a joy to replay. I will say, it definitely feels it's intended to play the Order campaign first and then the Disorder after, and I do recommend playing them in that order. No pun intended. Not only are these campaigns a good length for an expansion pack, there's also room for replayability, with different ways of tackling the mission. Great value for money here, especially if you got this back in the day. They're also a good challenge. Base game did feel a bit too forgiving, often let you sit back and take things at your own pace, which I'm guilty of. Winter Assault puts you under more pressure and lights a fire up your ass, particularly in the Disorder campaign, but isn't too harsh that it feels unfair. They struck a great balance here. So, do I recommend Winter Assault? In regards to the Definitive Edition, before the hotfix it was a recommendation with a huge asterisk. Now it's a recommendation with just a regular asterisk. The sound bug is still present but nowhere near as damaging as it was before, but it's damaging nonetheless. The original version though I can recommend no hesitation, only takes a bit of tinkering to get it running on modern hardware. DE annoyingly has a bit of a compromise with the sound bug, but everything else is solid. Well, next up is both Dark Crusade and Soulstorm, the last two expansions for Dawn of War. Reviewing them together may seem odd, but it will make sense. That's all for now, I'll see you again.